The certified letter arrived in the middle of the Ashton Ridge Summer Festival. I remember staring at the envelope while hearing children laughing somewhere out in the field behind my house. A soccer whistle blew in the distance. Music from one of the food trucks drifted across the grass while neighbors walked around carrying lemonade and paper plates like it was any normal Saturday afternoon. Meanwhile, a mail carrier stood awkwardly at my porch holding a bright red envelope stamped, "Urgent Legal Notice." My name's Grant Holloway, and that field behind Ashton Ridge had belonged to my family long before the subdivision ever existed. But according to the letter I was now holding in my hands, apparently none of that mattered anymore. The HOA demanded immediate removal of all unauthorized interference from what they described as established community property, including soccer equipment, picnic structures, overflow parking access, and seasonal event installations on my land. Then came the part that nearly made me laugh out loud. The HOA claimed they had acquired community integration rights over the property after years of uninterrupted neighborhood use. I looked up slowly from the paper. Families were everywhere across the field. Kids kicked soccer balls between portable goals near the west fence. Food trucks sat parked beside the gravel lane I personally paid to maintain every spring. Giant blue HOA banners hung from temporary wooden structures the board installed 2 summers earlier after I told them repeatedly not to drill anything permanent into the ground. And now they were threatening me with fines, property seizure, and legal action if I interfered with what they suddenly called community space. For a second, I honestly couldn't process what I was reading. That field wasn't just dirt to me. My grandfather nearly lost it back in the 70s after a brutal recession wiped out most of the family farm operations. He spent years rebuilding everything piece by piece, refusing every developer who tried to buy him out. I grew up working those acres beside him, learned to drive an old tractor there before I was tall enough to see over the steering wheel properly. Before he died, he made me promise one thing: protect this land, no matter what. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers after somebody scored a goal. I folded the letter carefully, walked back inside my house, and crossed the hallway to an old metal filing cabinet my grandfather used for property records. Most of the folders inside were faded with age: tax maps, boundary surveys, county permits. Then I found the one I was looking for. A worn manila folder labeled "Temporary Access Agreement, Never Signed." I stared at it for a long moment before smiling to myself, because that's when I realized the HOA had just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. I was 52 that summer, retired from commercial contracting after nearly 3 decades of building warehouses, office parks, and distribution centers across 3 counties. Most people around Ashton Ridge knew me as the quiet guy in the old farmhouse behind the subdivision, the one who waved politely, fixed his own fences, and rarely complained about anything. After my divorce, I learned to appreciate peace more than attention. That suited me fine. Longtime locals respected the Holloway family because my grandfather had spent half his life helping people around this county. During flood seasons, he'd lend tractors without charging a dime. During hard winters, he'd clear roads before county crews even showed up. I grew up believing neighbors were supposed to help each other without turning everything into contracts and legal paperwork. That's exactly why I let Ashton Ridge use parts of the Holloway field for years. The 34 acres sat directly behind the subdivision but legally remained outside HOA jurisdiction. My family fought multiple legal battles to keep ownership long before the neighborhood ever existed. When I inherited the property, I never imagined I'd need to defend it from the people living next door. So when residents needed space for youth soccer games, I allowed it. Charity fairs? Fine. 4th of July fireworks viewing? Sure. Overflow parking during community events? No problem. I never charged anyone money, never demanded leases, never made things complicated. But over time, the HOA leadership changed. The older board members who understood handshakes and respect slowly disappeared, replaced by newer people who treated the neighborhood like a corporate brand instead of a community. They obsessed over expansion plans, property values, image management, and controlling every visible inch around Ashton Ridge. I noticed the warning signs eventually, the permanent signs, the unauthorized landscaping, the way board members casually referred to my field as shared space. but I ignored it because I believed common sense would eventually win out. Turns out, common sense doesn't mean much when greed gets involved. I met Vanessa Whitmore 3 days after the certified letter arrived. Up until then, most of my interactions with the Ashton Ridge HOA had been minor annoyances, emails about event scheduling, requests to mow certain sections before holiday weekends, complaints about teenagers parking too close to the creek entrance during soccer tournaments. Nothing worth fighting over. Vanessa changed that immediately. She pulled onto my property in a black luxury SUV just after 9 in the morning while I was repairing a fence line near the southern edge of the field. 2 other vehicles followed behind her. One belonged to a surveying company. The other had county compliance decals on the side doors. That got my attention fast. Vanessa stepped out first, wearing a cream-colored blazer despite the July heat, holding a leather folder against her chest like she was arriving for a corporate acquisition meeting instead of trespassing on private property. Everything about her looked polished, controlled, calculated. She smiled constantly, but it never reached her eyes. Behind her came a thin man in an expensive gray suit carrying legal files, and another older guy unloading tripods and surveying equipment from the truck bed. Without even greeting me properly, Vanessa extended her hand. "Mr. Holloway," she said smoothly, "I'm glad we can finally begin resolving this situation professionally." Resolving. That word bothered me immediately because nobody had asked me whether there was a situation to resolve in the first place. I ignored her hand. "What exactly are they doing on my property?" I asked, pointing toward the survey crew already unloading orange stakes into the grass. Vanessa didn't even blink. "They're documenting integrated use boundaries for the HOA's legal filing." The attorney beside her adjusted his glasses and opened a folder. "Based on years of uninterrupted public utilization, infrastructure investment, and community reliance," he said mechanically, "the association is establishing functional occupancy claims over the Holloway field." I stared at him for a second, then laughed once. Not because it was funny, because the sheer arrogance sounded insane out loud. "You people seriously think using my land for soccer games means you own it now?" Vanessa folded her hands calmly. "It's significantly more complicated than that, Grant." I noticed she used my first name immediately while speaking to me like a difficult employee. Classic control tactic. She began walking across the field while talking, forcing me to either follow or stand there looking passive. The surveyors moved behind her, hammering orange stakes into the ground every 50 feet. Each strike felt personal. Vanessa gestured across the property like a real estate executive giving a presentation. "The HOA funded landscaping improvements for over 7 years. We installed irrigation extensions, maintained access lanes, coordinated public recreation, hosted community events, and provided infrastructure support." "Infrastructure support?" I repeated. She pointed toward the picnic structures near the north side of the field. "The pavilions, parking organization, event coordination, seasonal utility access." "You built those without permission." Her smile tightened slightly. "The community invested substantial resources into making this area functional public space." Public space. There it was again. Not once did she call it my property. The attorney stepped forward again. "Legally speaking, courts often consider public dependence and long-term integrated use when evaluating community occupancy matters." I could feel anger building in my chest now. Not explosive anger, the colder kind, the dangerous kind. Because I was finally starting to understand what this actually was. They weren't negotiating. They were laying groundwork, trying to create a paper trail that slowly erased my ownership piece by piece until fighting them became too expensive to survive. That realization hit even harder when more residents started gathering nearby. Word traveled quickly inside Ashton Ridge, and within 20 minutes people were standing around watching us like spectators at a public dispute. Parents pulled kids off the soccer field. Food truck workers leaned against their counters listening. Vanessa noticed the audience immediately. And that's when she shifted performances. Her tone softened dramatically. "Grant," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "nobody wants conflict here. The community simply needs stability after relying on this space for so many years." I actually felt my jaw tighten. There it was, the setup. She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the crowd, painting herself as reasonable while framing me as the problem. One woman near the soccer field crossed her arms. "Wait, he can actually shut all this down?" Another resident shook his head. "I thought the HOA owned this already." Vanessa sighed carefully like a disappointed teacher handling a difficult child. "We're hoping Mr. Holloway chooses cooperation instead of forcing unnecessary legal action that could impact community programs." Community programs. Legal action. She packaged theft inside public relations language so cleanly it almost sounded noble. Several people immediately started looking at me differently. Not like a property owner, like I was threatening something that belonged to them. That part honestly hurt more than I expected, because many of these people had brought me Christmas cards over the years. Their kids played baseball on this land. I let them watch fireworks from these hills every 4th of July without ever charging $1, and now they were staring at me like I was the villain. Vanessa saw it happening too. She knew exactly what she was doing. Then something caught my attention near the western side of the field. One of the surveyors was measuring around the large wooden pavilion the HOA installed 2 summers earlier. At first, I was too angry to think clearly, but then I noticed the concrete. Fresh anchor bolts, permanent footings. I walked over slowly while the surveyor stepped aside nervously. The structure wasn't temporary anymore. The support posts had been drilled directly into deep concrete foundations. I crouched near the base and brushed dirt away with my hand. No county permit tag, no inspection marker, nothing. I stood back up slowly. Then I looked farther across the field. The lighting poles near the parking lane, the underground irrigation lines, the electrical conduit running toward the food truck area. Permanent improvements, permanent structures, installed on my land, without permits, without contracts, without authorization. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare started, I realized Vanessa Whitmore may have just handed me the weapon that could destroy her entire HOA. The moment I saw those unpermitted concrete footings buried in my field, something inside me changed. Up until then, I'd still been hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Vanessa Whitmore was bluffing. Maybe the HOA attorney was throwing around complicated legal language to pressure me into signing some ridiculous access agreement. But permanent structures changed everything. Because permanent structures meant planning. Planning meant intent. And intent meant this whole thing started long before that certified letter ever reached my mailbox. So the next morning, I drove straight to the county records office. The woman behind the counter recognized me immediately. Small counties are like that. People remember families that have been around for generations. "You finally dealing with Ashton Ridge?" she asked quietly while pulling up property maps. That caught my attention. "Meaning?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Meaning your field's been showing up in a surprising number of zoning inquiries lately." That was the first real crack in Vanessa's story. Over the next several hours, I started digging through everything connected to the Holloway property. County tax filings, zoning requests, permit applications, land use records, easement maps, and archived HOA meeting minutes. The deeper I looked, the uglier things became. First discovery? The HOA never had a legal lease agreement for the field, not once. Not for the soccer leagues, not for festival parking, not for community events, nothing. For over a decade, Ashton Ridge had been using privately owned land based entirely on verbal permission. Mine. Second discovery? The HOA never properly ensured a single public event held on my property. I read that document 3 times because I genuinely couldn't believe it. Thousands of people had attended seasonal events there over the years. 4th of July celebrations, charity fundraisers, fall harvest festivals, weekend sports tournaments. And the HOA liability coverage excluded privately owned land unless formal usage contracts existed. Which meant if somebody had gotten seriously injured on my property during one of those events, the legal exposure could have financially destroyed everyone involved, including me. But the third discovery made my stomach turn. The HOA had been using resident dues to improve my property without authorization. I found landscaping invoices, irrigation installation payments, electrical work approvals, maintenance contracts, all approved internally by Vanessa Whitmore's board. They were spending HOA money to slowly transform my land into functional community infrastructure, without ever telling residents the property wasn't actually owned by the subdivision. That wasn't carelessness anymore. That looked intentional. And once I started seeing the pattern, I couldn't stop noticing it everywhere. By the end of the week, the atmosphere around Ashton Ridge changed completely. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly avoided eye contact. People stopped slowing down near my driveway. At the grocery store, conversations would die the second I walked into an aisle. Then the Facebook posts started. Somebody uploaded pictures of me standing beside the survey crews with captions like, "Local homeowner trying to shut down children's recreation space." Another post claimed I was secretly negotiating with developers to build luxury apartments behind the neighborhood. One woman wrote, "Imagine destroying a whole community just because you're bitter and greedy." Greedy. That word showed up constantly. Funny how quickly people forget years of free access once somebody tells them they're entitled to more. Meanwhile, Vanessa escalated fast. Within days, temporary fencing appeared across sections of my field. Bright signs were installed every 100 yards reading, "Ashton Ridge Community Property, Authorized Use Only." I ripped the first sign out of the ground myself. The next morning, 3 more appeared. Then county compliance officers suddenly started visiting my property. One inspected drainage runoff. Another questioned old agricultural equipment storage. A third claimed there had been anonymous environmental complaints regarding creek contamination. Anonymous complaints. Sure. Vanessa wasn't even hiding it anymore. She wanted pressure from every direction at once. Legal, social, financial, governmental. Classic intimidation strategy. The goal wasn't winning immediately. The goal was exhausting me until surrender became easier than resistance. Unfortunately for her, she picked the wrong man. Because commercial contracting teaches you something important after 30 years. Paper trails matter. And people who think they're smarter than everyone else usually leave behind a lot of evidence. So I kept digging. Every night, my dining room table disappeared beneath stacks of printed records and highlighted documents. I barely slept. Coffee replaced meals. By midnight, most evenings, I'd still be sitting there reviewing HOA minutes line by line, while old baseball games played quietly on mute in the background. That's when I found the email references. At first, it looked harmless. A short note from Vanessa discussing future integration opportunities connected to the field. But attached meeting summaries told a different story entirely. Buried deep inside archived board communications were discussions about expanding premium recreational assets, increasing subdivision valuation through adjacent land consolidation, and future clubhouse enhancement zones. I printed every page slowly. Then I found the sentence that made everything click. One board member had written, "Once long-term public dependence is established, acquisition leverage increases substantially." Acquisition leverage. They'd been planning this for years. The soccer programs, the festivals, the irrigation systems, the structures. None of it was generosity. It was strategy. A slow-motion land grab disguised as community development. And Vanessa Whitmore had orchestrated the entire thing. That realization sat in my chest like concrete. But things got worse 3 nights later. Around 11:30 p.m., I noticed headlights moving across the far edge of the field from my kitchen window. At first, I thought teenagers had snuck onto the property again. Then I heard heavy equipment. I killed the kitchen lights immediately. Outside, 2 flatbed trucks rolled slowly across the gravel access lane near the western hill. Workers wearing reflective vests unloaded pallets of concrete bags, lumber, and metal framing materials beside the existing pavilion. My pulse spiked instantly. No permits had been approved, no construction notices posted, which meant they were trying to build something quietly before legal action stopped them. I grabbed my old camera from the hallway closet and headed outside through the back porch without turning on any lights. The farther I moved into the darkness, the angrier I became. Portable work lamps illuminated my grandfather's field like an active construction site. Workers measured foundation lines. One man spray-painted utility markings directly into the grass. Another unloaded steel posts beside the soccer area. Permanent expansion. They were actually trying to physically occupy the land before the courts could intervene. I crouched behind the old tractor shed and started taking photographs. truck license plates, equipment serial numbers, workers unloading materials, concrete pallets, fresh excavation markings, every angle, every detail. At one point, I zoomed in close enough to spot the construction company logo printed on the side of a trailer. That was important, because legitimate contractors usually require permit verification before beginning work, meaning either they were lied to or somebody inside the HOA deliberately bypassed county approval processes. Both possibilities were dangerous. I stayed out there nearly an hour documenting everything while anger slowly transformed into something colder, more focused, more dangerous. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped thinking like a homeowner under attack and started thinking like a contractor investigating fraud. By the time the trucks finally pulled away after midnight, I already knew two things for certain. Vanessa Whitmore wasn't bluffing anymore, and neither was I. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table surrounded by photographs, permits, and property records, I finally started preparing for war. Once Vanessa Whitmore realized I wasn't backing down, the situation turned ugly fast. Not loud ugly, calculated ugly. The kind where pressure starts building from so many directions at once that you can barely tell where the attacks are coming from anymore. It started with county code enforcement. 3 separate complaints were filed against my property within a single week. One inspector claimed there were unsafe agricultural structures near the old tractor shed. Another suddenly became concerned about runoff contamination near the creek bed, despite the fact that the county had inspected that same drainage area less than a year earlier with 0 violations. Then came the environmental accusations. Apparently, anonymous residents were now claiming the Holloway field contained hazardous soil contamination from old farming equipment. Hazardous contamination. My grandfather rotated crops and raised hay, not nuclear waste. But accusations didn't need to make sense anymore. They just needed to create paperwork. And paperwork creates pressure. The legal threats escalated next. Almost daily, new letters arrived from the HOA's attorneys filled with aggressive language designed to sound terrifying to ordinary homeowners. They cited adverse possession, community dependency doctrine, equitable public reliance, economic damages caused by disruption of established recreational infrastructure. One sentence actually claimed I could be held financially liable for interfering with critical neighborhood youth programming. Critical youth programming. As if youth soccer somehow gave them ownership rights over 34 acres of private land. But the psychological pressure hit harder than the legal nonsense. One morning I walked outside and found my mailbox smashed open with a baseball bat. 2 days later, someone zip-tied a handwritten sign to my front fence that read, "Stop punishing children." Another night, rocks hit my porch around midnight before a car sped away down the road. Meanwhile, the online rumors became vicious. Neighborhood Facebook groups painted me like some greedy old villain trying to destroy the community for profit. One post claimed I was secretly negotiating with developers from Atlanta. Another accused me of planning to bulldoze the soccer fields for commercial storage warehouses because of my old contracting background. People who had eaten barbecue on my property less than a year earlier were now commenting things like, "Some people care more about money than community." That part stayed with me. Because not once, not a single time, did any of those people mention the fact I'd let them use the land for free for over a decade. It amazed me how quickly generosity became entitlement once people thought they might lose access to something. Still, for all Vanessa's pressure tactics, she made one critical mistake. She assumed fear would make me emotional. Instead, it made me organized. Very organized. The next Monday morning, I hired a land use attorney named Richard Velez, who specialized in property disputes and zoning fraud. Richard had spent 20 years fighting commercial development cases across the state and had the personality of a patient shark. Calm, quiet, dangerous. After reviewing the HOA filings for less than an hour, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Grant, these people either think you're stupid or they've been getting away with this behavior for a very long time." That was the first time since this started that someone validated what I already suspected. So we built a team. Richard brought in a retired county survey expert named Bill Fenwick, a 70-year-old chain smoker who could recite property easement laws from memory better than most practicing attorneys. Then we hired a title historian, a woman named Denise Harrow who specialized in reconstructing generational land ownership records. And suddenly, the story Vanessa Whitmore had carefully built started falling apart fast. Bill confirmed multiple HOA structures violated setback regulations and had been installed beyond legally permitted zones. Denise uncovered something even worse. The HOA had deliberately avoided formal lease agreements for years. At first, that sounded confusing. Wouldn't formal agreements actually help them? No, because legal leases would have acknowledged my ownership permanently. Instead, Vanessa's board intentionally kept everything informal while gradually expanding community usage year after year. Soccer today, parking tomorrow, electrical access next summer, permanent structures after that, step by step. Like termites eating through wood slowly enough nobody notices until the foundation collapses. Then Richard found inconsistencies inside archived HOA meeting minutes. Entire sections had been altered, votes removed, discussions rewritten, financial approvals reworded. One board summary claimed residents unanimously supported community field integration planning. But cross-referenced email records showed several board members had actually objected to spending HOA money on privately owned land. Their objections vanished from the final minutes completely. Vanessa hadn't just manipulated residents, she manipulated her own board. That discovery changed the entire tone of the investigation. This wasn't community overreach anymore. This looked like coordinated fraud. A few days later, I found myself standing inside my grandfather's old tractor shed for the first time in years. The place smelled like oil, dust, and old cedar wood. Sunlight cut through cracks in the walls, illuminating shelves packed with rusted tools and faded farm ledgers. I honestly wasn't looking for anything specific. Maybe I just needed to feel close to him again. Outside, Ashton Ridge kept growing bigger every year, with its polished entrances and fake small-town charm. But inside that shed, nothing had changed. My grandfather's old work gloves still hung beside the door exactly where he left them. I sat down beside an old cabinet and started opening drawers. That's where I found the journals. 3 weathered notebooks bound together with faded twine. Inside were handwritten entries dating back decades, property measurements, fence repairs, seasonal agreements with neighboring farmers, water access notes. But one passage stopped me cold. Written in shaky blue ink near the bottom of a page, my grandfather had written, "Never trust developers who call greed community improvement. They'll smile while measuring your land." I read that line 3 times, then another, and another, because suddenly Vanessa Whitmore made perfect sense to me. She wasn't protecting a neighborhood, she was protecting expansion, control, profit. And the Holloway field stood directly in the way of whatever larger vision she'd been building for Ashton Ridge. Sitting there inside that dusty shed, holding my grandfather's journals in my hands, I realized something important. This fight wasn't really about soccer fields anymore, or parking lanes, or HOA politics. It was about legacy, about how easy it is for decent people to get exploited when they mistake manipulation for community spirit. That field carried my family's history inside every acre, and Vanessa saw it as an opportunity, nothing more. That realization stripped away the last bit of hesitation I still had. So 3 nights later, after reviewing every photograph, permit record, invoice, and email we'd uncovered, I sat at my kitchen table beside Richard Velez and drafted a formal response to the HOA. Not surrender papers, not compromise terms. An invoice, a very large one. The invoice went out on a Tuesday morning. Richard Velez insisted we hand-deliver certified copies to every HOA board member personally instead of simply emailing legal counsel. According to him, legal threats feel abstract on a screen. But when someone physically signs for an envelope containing nearly $5 million in retroactive land use damages, that becomes very real very fast. I still remember sitting at my kitchen table while Richard reviewed the final paperwork one last time. Retroactive commercial land use fees, 11 years of unauthorized usage, parking revenue, vendor access, sports league operations, festival hosting, land restoration damages, Unauthorized construction penalties. Every event the HOA profited from while pretending my field belonged to the community had now been carefully documented and itemized. At the bottom sat the final number in bold print: $4,782,000. Even after weeks of preparation, seeing it in writing still felt surreal. Richard slid the papers into a legal envelope calmly. "The amount isn't really the important part," he said. I looked at him. "Then what is?" He leaned back in his chair. "Panic." Turns out he was right, because Ashton Ridge exploded within 48 hours. The first signs appeared online Wednesday afternoon when residents started posting screenshots of rumors inside neighborhood Facebook groups. Nobody knew exact details yet, but words like lawsuit, fraud, and bankruptcy spread through the subdivision almost instantly. By Thursday morning, groups of residents stood outside the clubhouse whispering nervously while board members rushed in and out of emergency meetings. And for the first time since this nightmare started, the confidence inside Ashton Ridge cracked. Most residents genuinely believed the HOA already owned the Holloway field. That was Vanessa Whitmore's real trick. She never directly lied. She simply blurred the truth for years. Community newsletters referred to the field as shared recreational grounds. HOA maps shaded my property the same color as subdivision-owned land. Event banners labeled it Ashton Ridge Community Space. Eventually, assumption became reality. Now homeowners were suddenly learning the HOA never legally owned the field, never leased it properly, and spent resident dues improving private property without disclosure. People were furious. Friday morning, Richard called me while I was repairing fencing near the creek. "You need to hear this," he said immediately. Then he placed me on speakerphone during a board conference call. Vanessa spoke first. "This invoice is fraudulent and intentionally inflammatory," she snapped. "Your client is attempting financial extortion against an entire community." Richard stayed calm. "No, Vanessa. My client is invoicing retroactive commercial land usage after years of unauthorized occupation and infrastructure development. The HOA maintained that field for years." "Yes," Richard replied, "which creates another serious legal issue considering HOA funds were used improving privately owned land without full resident disclosure." Silence followed. Then another board member interrupted nervously. "Wait, are you saying we used HOA dues on land we didn't actually own?" Nobody answered immediately, and that silence changed everything. Another voice jumped in. "If somebody got injured during those festivals, were we even covered by insurance?" Richard answered before Vanessa could. "That depends entirely on whether your insurance carrier approved recreational operations on privately owned land without formal lease agreements." Suddenly, everyone started talking over each other. One woman sounded panicked. "What do you mean without lease agreements?" That's when I realized Vanessa hadn't just manipulated residents. She'd manipulated her own board, too. By the weekend, Ashton Ridge felt completely different. Residents who once defended Vanessa online suddenly demanded answers. Rumors spread about lawsuits, collapsing home values, and massive special assessments. Because wealthy neighborhoods can survive drama, but financial fear, that terrifies people. Vanessa responded the only way she knew how, by attacking harder. Sunday evening, she released a public statement accusing me of trying to financially terrorize local families. According to her, I was exploiting children's programs and threatening community traditions for personal profit. A month earlier, people probably would have believed her. Now, not nearly as many. Because practical questions were finally replacing emotional reactions. Questions like, why were permanent structures built on land the HOA didn't own? Why were dues used for unauthorized improvements? And how long had Vanessa known the truth? Then my phone rang late Sunday night. Unknown number. A nervous woman spoke quietly after I answered. "Mr. Holloway?" "Yes." "This is Carol Fenwick, former HOA treasurer." Her voice dropped lower. "You need to know Vanessa is deleting records." I slowly looked over at Richard sitting across my kitchen table. Then Carol whispered something that made my stomach tighten immediately. "The emails you found?" she said. "Those are only the beginning." For a few seconds, neither Richard nor I said anything. Carol Fenwick's voice trembled slightly over the phone, like she was afraid someone might overhear her. "You still there?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I answered. "What records is Vanessa deleting?" A long pause followed, then Carol exhaled shakily. "Financial approvals, internal board discussions, development communications, anything connected to the field." Richard immediately grabbed a notepad. "Carol," he said calmly, "do you have copies?" Another pause. "Yes." That single word changed the entire direction of the case. Until then, Richard and I believed Vanessa Whitmore was manipulating HOA authority to gain control over my property gradually. Greedy? Absolutely. Abusive? Without question. But Carol's next sentence revealed something much worse. "She was never trying to protect community space," Carol whispered. "The field was part of a private development plan." I felt my stomach tighten instantly. Richard leaned forward. "What kind of development plan?" Carol lowered her voice even further. "A luxury expansion project, private clubhouse additions, executive event space. There were discussions about rezoning portions of the field later for commercial partnerships." For a second, the room went completely silent except for the hum of my kitchen refrigerator. Then everything suddenly made sense. The soccer leagues, the festivals, the irrigation systems, the permanent structures. None of it was about community generosity. It was positioning. Vanessa had spent years turning my grandfather's field into a financially valuable extension of Ashton Ridge, while slowly convincing residents the property already belonged to the HOA. And if nobody challenged her, eventually she would have absorbed the land completely. Carol agreed to meet us the following night in the parking lot behind an old hardware store outside town. Richard insisted on coming with me. When we arrived, Carol was already waiting inside her car, gripping a large accordion folder against her chest. The woman looked exhausted, not nervous anymore, terrified. The second she stepped out, she looked around the parking lot before speaking. "She's blaming everything on the board now," Carol said quietly. "But most of us never knew the full plan." Richard held out his hand. "The documents?" Carol hesitated briefly before passing him the folder. Inside were printed emails, budget drafts, deleted meeting summaries, and financial spreadsheets. Richard started flipping through pages immediately. Then his expression changed. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me one email. It was from Vanessa Whitmore to a private real estate consultant nearly 2 years earlier. The subject line read, "Future Expansion Integration Strategy." Below it, Vanessa had written, "Once recreational dependence becomes permanent, acquisition resistance should decrease substantially." I read the sentence twice. Then another document hit even harder. A preliminary architectural rendering, luxury clubhouse additions, private fitness center, outdoor entertainment pavilion, and right beside it, part of the Holloway field redesigned into premium event property. My property. Carol rubbed her forehead tiredly. She wanted Ashton Ridge to compete with high-end gated communities nearby, she said. Property values were flattening. Developers stopped investing. Vanessa thought expanding recreational assets would attract wealthier buyers. Richard kept reading silently. Then he stopped at another email chain. "Grant," he said slowly, "you need to see this." Attached to the email was a proposed partnership discussion with a regional development company. Not finalized, not signed, but far enough along to show intent. One sentence stood out immediately. "Current landowner unlikely to resist long-term community integration pressure indefinitely." I actually laughed once after reading that, not because it was funny, because the arrogance was unbelievable. Vanessa genuinely believed she could pressure me into surrendering generational land simply by slowly surrounding it with HOA activity until resistance became socially and financially exhausting. And honestly, without those records, she might have succeeded. Carol looked down at the pavement. "When I started questioning the accounting last year, she pushed me out quietly," she admitted. "After that, she handled most financial approvals herself." Richard closed the folder carefully. "This is fraud territory now." Carol nodded slowly. "She knows it too. That's why she's deleting things." For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I stopped seeing Vanessa Whitmore as just another controlling HOA president. She was something else entirely. A corporate predator hiding behind neighborhood language. Everything suddenly became clearer. The fake community messaging, the emotional manipulation, the pressure campaigns, the unauthorized construction. This was never about soccer fields, never about children, never about protecting neighborhood traditions. It was about money, about expansion, about turning my family's land into a profitable asset for people who thought smiling professionalism made theft look respectable. That realization hit harder than I expected, because my grandfather warned me about people exactly like this decades ago. Developers who call greed community improvement. People who measure your property while pretending to be your neighbor. As Carol drove away that night, Richard sat quietly in the passenger seat beside me, holding the folder in his lap. Finally, he looked over and said the one thing I'd already started realizing myself. "Grant, this isn't an HOA dispute anymore." I stared out through the windshield toward the distant lights of Ashton Ridge glowing against the darkness. "No," I said quietly. "It's a takeover that failed." The emergency HOA town hall meeting was scheduled for Thursday night at the Ashton Ridge Community Center. By the time Richard and I arrived, the parking lot was already overflowing. Cars lined both sides of the road while residents crowded outside the entrance in nervous little groups whispering to each other. Local bloggers filmed cell phone updates near the HOA sign, and I even spotted a small news crew unloading camera equipment beside the sidewalk. That's when I realized this thing had officially become bigger than neighborhood gossip. People wanted answers now. Inside, the auditorium felt tense immediately. Every chair was filled. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, holding screenshots of leaked emails and HOA financial documents that had been circulating online all week. The moment I walked through the doors beside Richard, conversations slowed. Heads turned. Phones lifted. A few months earlier, most of these people barely noticed me beyond a polite wave from my truck. Now half the room looked at me like I was either the villain or the only honest person left in Ashton Ridge. Richard leaned toward me quietly. "Stay calm tonight, no matter what happens." I nodded once. At the front of the room, Vanessa Whitmore stood behind a long folding table beside several visibly nervous board members. She still looked polished. Perfect hair, expensive blazer, confident posture. But the confidence looked forced now, like someone trying very hard to maintain control over a situation already slipping away. The second she saw me enter, her expression tightened briefly before the professional smile returned. Then she stepped toward the microphone. "Thank you all for attending tonight," she began smoothly. "I know emotions are running high right now, but this board remains committed to protecting Ashton Ridge families and preserving the traditions that make this community special." There it was immediately, not facts, emotion. Families, traditions, community. Vanessa always spoke like a politician during a crisis. She paced slowly across the stage while continuing her speech. "For years, our neighborhood has built memories together through youth sports, charity events, and recreational programs that brought families closer together." A few residents nodded uncertainly. Then she shifted exactly where I expected her to. "Unfortunately, certain individuals are now attempting to weaponize legal technicalities against the very people who helped build those traditions." Several people glanced toward me instantly. There was the setup. She wanted the room emotional before facts entered the conversation, because emotional crowds are easier to manipulate. Vanessa sighed dramatically before continuing. "The HOA has always acted in the best interest of this community. Every improvement made to the field area was done to preserve shared public space for future generations." Shared public space. Even now, she refused to call it my property. A man near the front suddenly raised his hand. "Then why are homeowners hearing about millions of dollars in legal damages?" The room went quiet immediately. Vanessa smiled tightly. "The current claims are highly exaggerated and designed to intimidate residents unnecessarily." Then another voice called out from the back. "Did the HOA actually own the field or not?" And just like that, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. For half a second, Vanessa froze, not long enough for everyone to notice, but long enough for me to notice. Then the smile returned. "The legal status of the property is currently under review," she answered carefully. Wrong response. Murmurs spread instantly across the auditorium. People started looking at each other nervously. One woman stood near the middle rows holding printed HOA statements in her hands. "Wait a minute," she said loudly. "If ownership wasn't clear, why were our dues paying for construction out there?" Another resident immediately added, "And why weren't homeowners informed about any legal risks?" Now the panic was becoming visible. Not emotional panic, financial panic, the kind that terrifies HOA neighborhoods faster than anything else. Vanessa stepped back toward the microphone quickly. "Right now there's a great deal of misinformation being spread intentionally to create fear inside this community." That's when Richard stood beside me. "Grant," he said quietly. I nodded once, and together we walked toward the front of the room. The crowd parted automatically while dozens of phones followed us across the auditorium, recording everything. Vanessa watched us approach carefully now, not confident anymore, defensive. Richard placed a thick stack of legal folders onto the front table with a loud thud that echoed through the room. Instant silence followed. Then he calmly connected a laptop to the projector behind the board members. Vanessa stepped forward sharply. "This meeting was not intended for outside legal presentations." Richard interrupted without even looking at her. "You invited public discussion regarding the Holloway property. Residents deserve accurate information." Several people immediately nodded. That rattled Vanessa visibly. The projector screen flickered on behind us. County property surveys appeared first. Highlighted boundary lines surrounded the entire Holloway field. Richard spoke clearly. "For clarification, the Holloway property has remained privately owned land for over 70 years, with continuous tax payments and no legal transfer of ownership to Ashton Ridge HOA. The room erupted into whispers instantly. Then came tax records, property maps, permit histories. Every document confirmed the same thing. The HOA never owned the land. Not once. Not ever. One older resident stood up slowly. "Then why did every community newsletter describe it as HOA recreational property?" Nobody at the board table answered. Vanessa folded her arms tightly now. Richard clicked the next slide. Photos filled the screen showing concrete foundations, electrical trenching, irrigation systems, lighting poles, and permanent pavilion structures. All of these installations, Richard explained calmly, were constructed on privately owned land without proper authorization or permit approval. A woman near the front looked horrified. "Wait, our HOA fees paid for that?" Richard nodded once. "Yes." The room exploded instantly. People started talking over each other while board members looked like they wanted to disappear beneath the table. "You told us the permits were approved. Are we legally liable for this? How much money was spent?" Vanessa grabbed the microphone quickly. "These improvements were made for community benefit and approved through standard operational procedures." Richard clicked the next slide before she could continue. Deleted emails filled the projector screen behind her, and suddenly the entire auditorium went silent. One email from Vanessa read, "Once recreational dependence becomes permanent, acquisition resistance should decrease substantially." Another discussed future expansion integration opportunities. Then came the architectural rendering, luxury clubhouse additions, private event spaces, expanded recreational development extending directly into the Holloway field. A shocked voice near the back shouted, "You were trying to take the land?" Vanessa immediately stepped forward. That document was preliminary planning material taken completely out of context, but nobody was listening anymore. The emotional tide inside the room had finally turned. Residents who defended her for months now looked betrayed. An older man slowly stood near the wall. I recognized him immediately. Walter Green. He'd lived beside Ashton Ridge longer than almost anyone there. Walter pointed directly toward me. "The Holloways let people use that land for free before this HOA even existed," he said loudly. "Grant's grandfather opened those fields during flood seasons when half this county couldn't reach the highway." Several older residents nodded immediately. Another woman stood up. "My daughter had soccer practice there for 6 years," she said. "Grant never charged anybody a penny." More voices joined in. "The 4th of July fireworks were free." He let churches hold charity events there. My husband parked equipment there after the tornado cleanup. Vanessa tried interrupting again. This board has always acted in the community's best interests. That's when I finally stepped forward. The room quieted almost immediately. I looked around slowly at the same people who'd spent weeks treating me like some greedy outsider trying to destroy their neighborhood. Then I spoke calmly. Generosity doesn't transfer ownership. Complete silence. I continued. Just because I let people enjoy that land doesn't mean anybody gets to steal it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Vanessa stayed quiet for once, because deep down, everyone in that room knew it was true. I looked directly toward the board table. My grandfather spent his entire life protecting that property. My family paid every tax bill, handled every legal dispute, and maintained every acre long before Ashton Ridge existed. Then I gestured toward the projector screen behind us. And while we were helping neighbors in good faith, your HOA was planning expansion projects behind closed doors. Vanessa's composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous," she snapped suddenly. "You're manipulating these people with selective documents and emotional stories while threatening families with financial destruction." Phones lifted higher instantly. Residents started shouting now. "You lied to us! Did you delete records or not? You hid this from homeowners!" One board member actually pushed his chair back and walked away from the table entirely. And somewhere near the front row, I noticed a local blogger holding his phone directly on Vanessa, while live stream comments flooded across the screen in real time. Every second of her meltdown was being recorded. The fallout from the town hall meeting hit Ashton Ridge like a tornado. Within 48 hours, county investigators formally opened inquiries into HOA financial conduct, unauthorized land development, and possible fraud tied to the Holloway field. Local news stations picked up the story almost immediately after clips of Vanessa Whitmore losing control during the meeting spread online. By Monday morning, satellite vans were parked outside the subdivision entrance, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Vanessa looked afraid. The emergency court hearing started 2 weeks later at the county courthouse downtown. But this wasn't just one case anymore. It had evolved into 3 separate battles happening simultaneously: the property dispute, the financial investigation, and an emergency petition filed by residents demanding temporary dissolution of the HOA board. The courthouse looked more like a political scandal than a land dispute. Reporters crowded the front steps every morning. Residents packed the hallways, whispering nervously, while attorneys carried giant document boxes between hearing rooms. Richard Velez loved every second of it. "People like Vanessa survive in darkness," he told me outside the courthouse one morning. "Public exposure changes the entire game." Inside the courtroom, Vanessa still tried maintaining the same polished image she always used at HOA meetings. Perfect posture, controlled voice, expensive suits. But the illusion was cracking now. Because this wasn't a neighborhood Facebook group anymore. This was court, and courts run on evidence. Richard opened aggressively during the first hearing. For nearly 2 straight hours, our legal team presented historical ownership records, continuous Holloway family tax payments, county land surveys, permit violations, and photographs of unauthorized construction installed across my field. Every document reinforced the same brutal truth. The HOA never owned a single acre of the property, not once, not ever. Then came the financial records. That's when the courtroom atmosphere shifted completely. Richard projected HOA expenditure reports showing resident dues funded, electrical trenching, irrigation systems, concrete foundations, parking lane expansion, and recreational structures, all installed on privately owned land without legal authorization. One county investigator sitting near the front actually stopped taking notes for a second and looked directly toward Vanessa. That moment mattered, because you could physically feel the court beginning to understand this wasn't confusion anymore. It was coordination. Vanessa's attorneys fought constantly to slow everything down. Objection after objection, procedural arguments, motions to delay hearings, claims that digital evidence had been taken out of context. At one point, Vanessa's lead attorney even tried arguing that long-term community dependence created implied shared use expectations overriding strict technical ownership interpretation. The judge looked unimpressed immediately. "Are you attempting to argue," he asked slowly, "that repeated unauthorized usage transfers property rights?" The attorney hesitated. That hesitation hurt them badly. Meanwhile, Richard stayed calm the entire time. Because unlike Vanessa's team, we had receipts for everything. Then the witness testimony started, and that's when the real damage began. The first major witness was Bill Fenwick, the retired county survey expert Richard hired during the investigation. Bill walked into court carrying 3 rolled-up survey maps beneath one arm and looking exactly like a man who'd spent 40 years arguing with developers for a living. Vanessa's attorneys clearly underestimated him. That turned out to be a mistake. For nearly an hour, Bill methodically broke down every unauthorized modification installed across the Holloway field. Electrical conduit placement, improper utility trenching, permanent concrete foundations, lighting installations, and irrigation extensions crossing private property lines. Then he delivered the statement that changed the energy inside the courtroom completely. "In my professional opinion," Bill said calmly, "these were not temporary recreational improvements. They were long-term infrastructure investments intended to establish permanent occupancy patterns." Permanent occupancy patterns. You could actually hear people shifting uncomfortably behind us after he said it. Vanessa's attorney immediately stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Fenwick," he said smoothly, "isn't it possible these installations were simply intended to support community activities?" Bill didn't even blink. You don't pour permanent concrete footings and underground electrical systems for temporary activities. A few quiet laughs spread through the courtroom. Vanessa looked furious. Then came the contractors. One by one, construction vendors testified they were hired through HOA-authorized work orders to expand recreational infrastructure around the field. Several admitted they assumed the property already belonged to Ashton Ridge because that's how the projects had been described internally. One contractor even produced printed project notes labeled "Future Clubhouse Expansion Zone." That document hit hard, especially after Richard linked it directly to the leaked development proposals Carol Fenwick provided. Suddenly, the story stopped looking like an HOA misunderstanding. It started looking like a planned acquisition strategy. But the real turning point came when Carol herself took the stand. The entire courtroom became noticeably quieter when she walked in. Because by then, everyone knew Carol was the insider. The former HOA treasurer, the woman who kept copies of deleted records. Vanessa refused to even look at her. Richard approached carefully. "Ms. Fenwick," he began, "did the HOA board fully disclose the legal risks associated with the Holloway property to residents?" "No." "Did Vanessa Whitmore discuss future development opportunities involving the field?" Carol hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Yes." Vanessa's attorney immediately stood. "Objection, speculative." Richard calmly held up printed emails. "Not speculative." The judge allowed it. And that's when Carol delivered the testimony that shattered whatever credibility Vanessa still had left. "She told board members the field would eventually become impossible for Mr. Holloway to reclaim once the community became dependent on it." The courtroom went dead silent. Even Vanessa looked stunned for a second. Carol continued quietly. "She said public pressure would force eventual integration." Richard placed another email onto the evidence screen behind her. This one referenced commercial rezoning opportunities, executive recreational partnerships, and premium redevelopment potential. Then came the phrase nobody in that courtroom forgot afterward: landowner resistance expected to decrease over time. I watched several residents in the gallery physically react to that sentence, because suddenly they understood the truth. Vanessa never saw the Holloway field as community space. She saw it as inventory, property waiting to be absorbed. Vanessa's attorneys tried recovering quickly after that. They attacked Carol's credibility, questioned deleted email authenticity, claimed financial records were incomplete. But every defense collapsed almost immediately, because digital timestamps, county filings, payment approvals, and contractor invoices all matched perfectly. The paper trail was airtight now, and everybody in that courtroom knew it. By the third week of hearings, Ashton Ridge was falling apart in real time. Residents stopped defending the HOA publicly altogether. Emergency board resignations started hitting almost daily as members tried distancing themselves from Vanessa Whitmore before the investigations got worse. One board member actually left town completely after county investigators requested financial records connected to contractor payments. That's how bad things had become. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited every morning hoping for another explosion. And eventually, they got one. Because Vanessa finally decided to testify herself. Richard warned me beforehand. "She's going to try rebuilding sympathy," he said quietly outside the courtroom. "Watch for emotional language instead of factual answers." The second Vanessa took the stand, the performance began. She spoke softly at first, controlled, professional, carefully wounded. "For years," she told the court, "my only goal was protecting the Ashton Ridge community and preserving opportunities for local families." There it was again. Families, community, children. Vanessa always hid behind emotional language whenever facts cornered her. She described soccer games, charity festivals, holiday events, and neighborhood traditions, like she was delivering a campaign speech instead of sworn testimony. Then she looked directly toward the judge. "Grant Holloway allowed the community to depend on that land for over a decade," she said. "Residents built their lives around those programs." Richard stood slowly, and that's when the tone of the courtroom changed. "Ms. Whitmore," he began calmly, "did you or did you not discuss future commercial redevelopment opportunities involving the Holloway field?" Vanessa hesitated. "A variety of conceptual discussions occurred over the years. Yes or no?" "Yes." Richard walked toward the evidence screen. "Did those discussions include rezoning portions of the property for premium recreational development?" Vanessa shifted slightly. "There were exploratory conversations. Did those conversations involve private developers?" Silence. Short. Dangerous. "Yes." You could hear people whispering instantly behind us. Richard clicked the next slide onto the projector. Financial transfer records appeared across the courtroom screen, then invoices, consulting payments, shell company filings, and finally, bank records tied to a development consulting firm connected directly to Vanessa's brother-in-law. Even the judge leaned forward at that point. Richard's voice stayed perfectly calm. "Can you explain why undeclared consulting payments connected to Ashton Ridge expansion planning were routed through a privately registered development entity?" Vanessa looked completely blindsided now. "This has nothing to do with community land usage. It has everything to do with motive." Vanessa's attorney objected immediately, but the damage was already done, because now the courtroom wasn't looking at an overprotective HOA president anymore. They were looking at someone who may have been positioning private land for profitable redevelopment behind residents' backs. And once that perception changed, everything collapsed fast. Then Richard called my name. "Grant Holloway." For a second, the courtroom suddenly felt very quiet. I walked to the witness stand slowly while cameras clicked somewhere behind me. The bailiff swore me in. Then Richard asked the simplest question anyone had asked during the entire trial. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "why did you allow the HOA to use your property for so many years?" I looked around the courtroom for a moment before answering. Because honestly, after everything that happened, the answer still felt painfully simple. Because I trusted them. Silence filled the room instantly. I told the court about my grandfather, about flood seasons, about helping neighbors without contracts, about believing generosity mattered more than paperwork. Then I talked about the day the certified letter arrived demanding I surrender my own land. And for the first time since this started, my voice almost cracked. Not from anger, from disappointment. I watched people my family helped for years suddenly act like kindness meant ownership, I said quietly. Like generosity automatically erased boundaries. Then I looked directly toward Vanessa. And the worst part is, she counted on that. The courtroom stayed silent for several seconds after I finished speaking. Even Vanessa Whitmore stopped looking at her attorneys. Because by then, nobody was really arguing about ownership anymore. The real question had become how far the HOA went trying to take something that never belonged to them in the first place. Richard returned to the center of the courtroom slowly. "Your Honor," he said, "this case ultimately comes down to 3 facts." He raised one finger. The HOA commercially benefited from privately owned land for over a decade. Second finger. They occupied and improved that land without formal agreements or legal authorization. Third finger. And they attempted to convert community dependence into ownership leverage. Every word landed hard. Vanessa's legal team made one final attempt to recover. They argued the Holloway field had become socially integrated into Ashton Ridge community life. They claimed residents relied on the recreational space and that dismantling long-standing public use would unfairly harm homeowners who acted in good faith. But the judge looked exhausted by the argument at that point, because emotionally persuasive language couldn't erase years of documentation, financial records, unauthorized construction, and concealed redevelopment planning, especially not after the digital evidence surfaced. Deleted emails, financial transfers, rezoning discussions, development proposals. The paper trail buried them. By late afternoon, the courtroom felt emotionally drained. Residents sat quietly now instead of whispering. Several former HOA supporters wouldn't even look toward Vanessa anymore. One board member actually looked physically sick, while county investigators reviewed financial exhibits near the front row. Then the judge finally began delivering his ruling. The room went completely still. He first confirmed continuous Holloway family ownership of the field based on historical land records, tax history, survey documentation, and lack of any legal transfer agreement. Then came the part that hit Ashton Ridge hardest. The court determined the HOA improperly used resident dues to improve privately owned property while failing to disclose significant legal and financial risks to homeowners. County investigators were formally authorized to continue reviewing fraud allegations, financial misconduct, and possible unlawful development negotiations tied to HOA leadership. Vanessa looked pale now, actually pale. Then the judge addressed my retroactive lease claim directly. "The court recognizes," he said carefully, "that the Ashton Ridge HOA derived measurable commercial and organizational benefit from long-term usage of the Holloway property without formal contractual authorization." You could hear people holding their breath. "As such," he continued, "the plaintiff's claim for retroactive compensation is partially upheld subject to adjusted valuation review." That single sentence detonated across the courtroom. Several residents closed their eyes immediately. One former board member dropped his head into his hands. Because everybody understood what it meant. Financial penalties were coming, serious ones. Then came the final blow. The judge approved emergency restructuring proceedings against the HOA leadership pending ongoing fraud investigations and temporarily removed Vanessa Whitmore from all board authority effective immediately. Vanessa finally snapped. "This is insane!" she shouted suddenly while standing up. "These people built this community because of me." The judge's expression hardened instantly. "Ms. Whitmore," he said sharply, "sit down." But she kept going. "You're rewarding greed. He let the community use that land for years." That's when the judge delivered the line nobody in that courtroom would ever forget. He looked directly at Vanessa Whitmore and said, "Kindness does not nullify ownership." Complete silence followed, heavy silence, the kind that settles into people permanently. Vanessa slowly sat back down while reporters practically sprinted out of the courtroom to break the story first. Around me, residents looked emotionally exhausted, some angry, some embarrassed, some betrayed. But for me, I mostly felt tired. Tired from months of pressure, months of accusations, months of watching generosity get twisted into entitlement. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Richard gathered our files calmly and looked over at me. "You okay?" I stared out the courthouse windows toward the fading evening light. Then I thought about my grandfather standing in that field decades earlier warning me about people who smile while measuring your land. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally felt like I kept my promise to him. By Early Ridge barely looked like the same neighborhood anymore. The courtroom battles were over, but the aftermath lingered everywhere. County investigators continued digging through HOA financial records while temporary administrators took control of the association's operations. Vanessa Whitmore disappeared from public view almost immediately after the hearings ended. Rumors spread that multiple fraud inquiries were still active, but honestly, by then I stopped caring where she went. I was too busy reclaiming my land. The first thing removed were the illegal HOA structures. Crews arrived at sunrise one cold Monday morning and started dismantling everything Vanessa's board had installed without authorization. The oversized pavilion, the unauthorized lighting poles, the irrigation systems, the concrete parking barriers, even the giant community property signs bolted into the ground near the western entrance. I stood near the old fence line, watching excavators tear out concrete footings buried deep beneath the field. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious. Mostly I felt relieved, like something heavy had finally stopped pressing against my chest after months of tension. The field looked ugly at first, once everything was removed. Deep tire scars cut across the grass where construction vehicles had spent months tearing through the property. Sections near the pavilion area were almost completely dead from equipment traffic and unauthorized trenching. But at least it was mine again. Legally, publicly, undeniably. A few weeks later, I started restoring the land myself. Every morning, I'd wake up before sunrise, pour coffee into an old thermos, and head out toward the damaged sections with seed bags and equipment loaded into the truck bed. There was something peaceful about the work. No lawyers, no cameras, no hearings, just dirt, grass, and silence. I reseeded damaged areas near the soccer field first, then repaired drainage sections around the creek where contractors had dug illegal utility trenches months earlier. For the first time in nearly a year, the property actually felt calm again. Eventually, I turned my attention toward my grandfather's old barn. The place had slowly deteriorated during all the legal chaos. Paint peeled from the exterior walls. Sections of roofing needed replacement. One side leaned slightly from storm damage that I never found time to repair while fighting the HOA. So I fixed it, piece by piece, the same way my grandfather would have done it. Some afternoons I'd work alone for hours, replacing boards or reinforcing beams while sunlight filtered through the old wooden rafters overhead. And honestly, those were probably the first genuinely peaceful moments I'd had since this nightmare began. Then something happened I never expected. People from Ashton Ridge started showing up. At first it was awkward. One older resident named Walter Green brought over fence posts and quietly helped repair the western property line without saying much. A week later, two teenagers who used to play soccer on the field volunteered to help spread grass seed across damaged areas. Then others started coming too. A woman whose daughter held birthday parties on the field for years showed up with homemade food one afternoon. Another resident apologized directly for believing the online rumors about me. Not everybody apologized, of course. Some people still avoided eye contact whenever they drove past my property. But enough did. Enough to matter. And slowly, the atmosphere around Ashton Ridge began changing too. The new HOA leadership moved carefully after the scandal. Temporary administrators introduced mandatory financial transparency policies, independent audits, and strict term limits for future board members. Residents demanded oversight now, because once people learn how badly trust can be abused, they stop handing power away so easily. By summer, the Holloway field finally started looking alive again. Fresh grass covered most of the damaged sections where construction vehicles once tore through the property. The deep tire grooves near the old pavilion site slowly faded beneath new growth, and for the first time in months, the land stopped looking like a battleground. It started looking like home again. One evening near the end of June, I was repairing fencing near the creek when I heard children laughing somewhere behind me. At first, I froze instinctively. After everything that happened, noise from the field still triggered tension in my chest automatically. But this time was different. A small group of kids were playing catch near the western hill while two parents watched from folding chairs nearby. The second they noticed me, both adults immediately stood up. Not defensively, respectfully. One of them walked over slowly. "Mr. Holloway," he said carefully, "I just wanted to thank you again for allowing seasonal access this summer." Seasonal access. not community ownership, not public entitlement, an agreement. That difference mattered more than most people realized. After the court rulings, Richard helped me draft formal seasonal use contracts for limited recreational activities on the property. Soccer practices, holiday fireworks viewing, charity events, small community gatherings. Clear boundaries, clear liability terms, clear permissions. No assumptions anymore. And surprisingly, once everything became honest and transparent, the tension disappeared. Because respectful people usually accept boundaries when those boundaries are communicated clearly. That was one of the hardest lessons I learned through this entire experience. Generosity without protection eventually attracts exploitation. For years, I believed good intentions alone were enough to keep things fair between neighbors. Turns out fairness needs structure, too. That realization stayed with me often while restoring the property, especially inside my grandfather's old barn. One rainy afternoon, I was sorting through storage cabinets looking for replacement tools when I discovered an old photo album buried beneath a stack of faded farm ledgers. Most of the pictures were damaged with age. Family cookouts, harvest seasons, old tractors, county fairs. Then one photograph stopped me cold. It showed my grandfather standing beside me in the Holloway field when I was probably 10 years old. The sun was rising behind us. Same western hill, same tree line, same field. I stared at that picture for a long time, sitting there alone in the barn while rain hammered softly against the roof overhead, because suddenly I understood something I hadn't fully realized during the legal battle. This wasn't just about protecting land. It was about protecting memory, family sacrifice, history, promises. Everything my grandfather fought to preserve existed inside those acres long before Ashton Ridge ever appeared. And for a while, I almost lost sight of that beneath all the anger. I carefully carried the photograph back inside the house later that evening and placed it beside the old filing cabinet where this entire nightmare truly began. Right next to the folder labeled, Temporary Access Agreement, Never Signed. Sometimes I still catch myself looking at both items together, the photograph and the paperwork. One representing trust, the other representing what happens when trust meets greed. But strangely enough, I don't regret helping the community all those years. Not completely. Because despite everything Vanessa Whitmore tried to turn Ashton Ridge into, there were still decent people living there. People who simply got manipulated. People who forgot boundaries because somebody in authority convinced them ownership didn't matter anymore. And maybe that's the dangerous thing about entitlement. It rarely announces itself honestly at first. Usually it disguises itself as community. By the time autumn arrived, a Holloway field looked almost untouched by the chaos that nearly destroyed it. The damaged sections near the western entrance had fully regrown. Fresh grass covered the old construction scars so completely that unless you knew exactly where to look, you'd never guess heavy machinery once tore through that land for months. Nature has a way of reclaiming peace slowly. One morning just after sunrise, I walked out toward the center of the field, carrying a thermos of coffee, while cold fog drifted low across the grass. Everything was quiet again. No legal threats, no HOA banners, no construction crews, just wind moving softly through open land. I stopped near the same hill where children used to watch 4th of July fireworks every summer and looked across the property for a long moment. Then I noticed something that hit harder than I expected. The last visible tire scar left behind by the HOA construction trucks had finally disappeared beneath fresh grass, completely gone. I stood there staring at it quietly while the morning sun slowly rose over the tree line. And honestly, that felt more meaningful than the courtroom victory ever did. Because lawsuits end. Judges issue rulings, but healing takes longer. The field taught me that. So did my grandfather. For years, I believed avoiding conflict automatically made someone a good neighbor. I thought silence kept peace. I thought generosity alone protected relationships. I was wrong. Boundaries matter, paperwork matters, and trusting people without accountability eventually invites the wrong kind of person into your life. People like Vanessa Whitmore count on decent people staying quiet. They rely on guilt, social pressure, and emotional manipulation because those tactics work surprisingly well against individuals who simply want peace. That's probably the biggest thing I learned through all of this. Kindness without boundaries eventually becomes vulnerability. But despite everything that happened, I refused to let bitterness take root inside me. The field was still being used now. Children still played soccer there during certain weekends. Families still gathered for fireworks every 4th of July. Churches still hosted seasonal charity events near the creek entrance. The difference was simple now. Respect came first. Every activity operated through clear agreements and honest communication, instead of entitlement disguised as community spirit. And strangely enough, people appreciated the field more after boundaries existed, because ownership had finally been acknowledged. One evening near sunset, Walter Green stopped beside the fence while I repaired a gate hinge near the barn. He leaned against the post quietly for a moment before speaking. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you," he said. That hit me harder than I expected. Because throughout this entire fight, that's really all I wanted, to keep my promise. After Walter left, I walked back inside the barn and looked again at the old photograph sitting on the workbench. Me, my grandfather, the sunrise behind us, and the Holloway field stretching endlessly into the distance. Same land, different generation, same fight maybe, just wearing different clothes now. I smiled to myself quietly before turning off the barn lights and stepping outside. The wind moved softly through the grass while the last sunlight disappeared behind Ashton Ridge in the distance, and for the first time in a very long time, the land finally felt peaceful again. A few weeks after everything finally settled down, I found myself sitting alone on the hood of my truck near the center of the Holloway field just before sunrise. That used to be my grandfather's favorite time of day. He always said you could learn a lot about people by how they treated land they didn't personally own, whether they respected it or tried controlling it the second they thought nobody would stop them. Back then, I never fully understood what he meant. Now I do. Because this entire nightmare with Ashton Ridge was never really about soccer fields or parking spaces. It wasn't about fireworks or picnic pavilions either. It was about entitlement, about people convincing themselves that access eventually becomes ownership. And honestly, that kind of thinking is becoming more common everywhere now. Some people see kindness and mistake it for weakness. They see patience and assume there are no boundaries. Then one day they push too far and act shocked when consequences finally arrive. For years, I believed being a good neighbor meant avoiding conflict at all costs. I thought helping people without paperwork proved trust still mattered in the world. But this experience taught me something important. Good intentions still need protection, because not everybody values generosity the same way. Some people appreciate it, others weaponize it. Vanessa Whitmore built her entire strategy around one assumption, that I'd stay quiet long enough for the Holloway field to slowly stop feeling like mine. And honestly, if I hadn't fought back when I did, she probably would have succeeded. That realization stayed with me for a long time after the court hearings ended. Not because I was angry anymore, but because it forced me to understand something uncomfortable. Silence enables abuse far more often than people realize. Sometimes protecting peace actually requires confrontation. Sometimes saying no is healthier than years of quiet resentment. And sometimes paperwork matters a whole lot more than handshakes. That doesn't mean I regret helping the community all those years. I don't. Kids made memories on that field. Families gathered there. People celebrated birthdays, holidays, and milestones on land my grandfather fought to preserve decades ago. There's still something beautiful about that. But now those things happen honestly, with permission, with respect, with boundaries. That's the difference. A few evenings ago, I walked the property one last time before sunset and stopped near the western hill overlooking Ashton Ridge. Children were practicing soccer again in the distance. Parents sat nearby talking quietly. No giant HOA banners, no fake ownership signs, no construction crews. Just open land and people enjoying it respectfully, the way it always should have been. I stood there for a while listening to the wind move through the grass before finally heading back toward the house. And somewhere along the way I realized something else too. The field didn't just survive all of this, so did I. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, property dispute, manipulative leadership, or someone who mistook your kindness for weakness, share your story in the comments. And subscribe for more stories about ordinary people standing up against greed, corruption, and abuse of power.